for our society, we start out by making laws. Those laws are really generalized, really vague, and then we write regulations that tell us how to enforce the law. And so that's where we're going next. This is where you got to pay attention, because these regulations are what will be cited if you have any sort of Humane Slaughter Act violation. What I've tried to do in this case is include examples wherever I possibly can of potential things that could result in non-compliance issues. For more information, in the back of your books today, I've included several articles, as well as an FSIS directive. I've included Directive 6900.2, Revision 2. That is the Humane Handling and Animal Welfare Directive. That one tells you how the FSIS is going to approach enforcement. It also talks about a program called the Systematic Approach to Animal Welfare, which is kind of like HACCP for animal handling. And that's another thing we'll get into a little bit with you guys in just a little while, because that can help to protect you a little bit from things going wrong. There are also a few articles in there that I've written for the National Provisioner. Two of them cover the enforcement actions. They're summaries, annual summaries of the enforcement actions from 2013 and 2014 at federally inspected slaughter facilities. It's a good read. It tells you where our challenges lie. In addition, there's also another article that talks about how we shouldn't be using the corneal reflex to check for consciousness in electrically stunned animals. This is something I'll get to a little bit later with you guys. If you're electrically stunning pigs, you shouldn't be touching their eyes. I did a study about 3 years ago. We published that in the Journal of Animal Science, where we found that in pigs that had their hearts stopped, so we caused a cardiac arrest step after we electrically stunned the animals, 80% of those pigs still had a corneal reflex even after the heart was stopped, completely stopped. And so we shouldn't be touching eyeballs in animals that are electrically stunned, but it works really well for animals that are captive bolt or firearm stunned. So let's talk a little bit first about the first section of 9 CFR 313. That's focused on the pens, the driveways, and the ramps in the facility. So non-compliance is going to be documented, and this specific regulation will be cited if the condition of the facilities appear likely to injure or are injuring animals. That's the important thing to take away from this. So this could show up in cases of extremely slippery flooring, broken gates, broken pens. Let's see, what else can we run into here? Cases where the facility may have excessive clutter that could cause the animals to slip and fall. So those are the sorts of things that will be cited in this case. In addition, if vehicles or ramps are not properly positioned leading to the injury of animals, that's an issue as well. Now for most small facilities, we don't run into too many issues with this, but in larger federally inspected plants, one issue that we had to grapple with quite a while ago, it's not a problem anymore, was the alignment of semi-trailers with unloading docks. That's like the first important step that we have to pay attention to. If we get potloads of cattle in or potloads of pigs in, we got to make sure that we're lined up very tightly with the unloading dock, because if there's enough of a gap, you guys can imagine what will happen. You'll start unloading, one animal's foot's going to slip through that crack at some point, and either the inertia of their own body or the force that comes from the animals behind them is going to end up snapping a leg. And so this is one place we need to pay attention. Slipping and falling is also an issue too. Now I'll tell you this, the big thing that we need to look for are outcomes here. And so when it comes to slipping and falling, we need to be looking at how often are animals actually falling down when we're handling. This is something I look for, especially when I go out and I visit dairy facilities. You'll see some dairies where the floors are slick. They are really slick. Because we have a habit when we're pouring concrete in dairy facilities to lay it out real nice, beautiful flat work, and then just broom finish it, just brush it with a stiff bristle broom. And that looks really nice. It feels really great on our rubber-soled shoes when we're walking around on that surface. And 3 or 4 or 5 months down the road, that is like ice, especially when it's wet. So if you're designing new facilities, stamp your concrete. Put an aggressive stamp in your concrete in your facilities. That'll help you out quite a bit with falling issues. But again, we have to stay outcome focused. Because I've seen some very, very good animal handlers that don't have any issues with animals slipping or falling on some really slippery surfaces. Whereas others might try to force things a little bit too much, and you'll see beautiful facilities with a lot of slipping and falling because the animals are being forced. And so it's sort of two pieces here. The facility and the people. The right people will make a facility work, even a poor facility work. So the next thing we get to is that there's a specific requirement for a roof over the suspect pen. Now I know that in smaller state-inspected facilities, you may oftentimes have a roof over your entire holding area. That's pretty common. This is really focused more on larger plants where you may have outdoor holding facilities. This is very, very common with larger beef facilities in particular. So the requirement here is that animals that are classified as U.S. suspect are given a place where they can be protected from the elements before they're either humanely euthanized or they're moved along to slaughter. So that's the main reason for it. So in your case, in a state-inspected facility, you just have to have a place identified that you would use as a suspect pen if you had an animal that was classified as a suspect, and it just has to have a roof over it. That's all you need to do. In most cases, you may not even be receiving suspect animals. Next, we'll get to the handling of livestock. This is the place in the regulations where we do see some challenges sometimes with compliance. And one of the issues we run into in particular are electric prod use. So this is one of the cases where the regulation is not incredibly clear. The reg reads that electric prods shall not be used in a manner considered excessive by the inspector. So I want to take a poll quickly here. If we're thinking about the number of times an electric prod is placed to an animal, is there anybody here that feels that 1 time would be excessive? 2? 3? 15? Okay, we've got a hand up. All right, that's good. Yeah, you see that? You see how that word excessive means different things to different people? That's the issue. And so the same thing would go for inspection personnel because they are people too. And so in that case, there's variance, I should say, in how that regulation is enforced. Here's the general rule of thumb. Turn to our industry guidelines. The American Meat Institute Foundation has a beautiful program laid out for the humane handling and care of livestock and slaughter facilities. And in that specific guidebook, it explains that we shouldn't be using electric prods on more than 25% of the cattle and pigs that move through our slaughter facilities. I'll tell you that a lot of larger slaughter facilities are well below that mark. And they try to get it as low as possible. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that there's a point, though. We have to strike a balance here. There's a point where an appropriately placed shock with an electric prod is far more humane than what could happen otherwise. And I've seen this happen before where a facility says, all right, I'm going to do right by my animals and I'm going to take away the electric prods, when that's all that the animal handlers are used to using. What they're going to do is find something else they can use. Their frustration level will increase, and you're going to see people beating animals. And so at that point, it actually becomes less humane. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that if an animal is having a very difficult time entering a stun box, for example, this is the place where to typically see this issue. This might be the place where you have to use an electric prod, but it should not be in your hand every time you go out to get an animal and bring it in for knocking. The other thing too, and this is kind of a relic within the regulation, is it says that the output of the electric prod must not exceed 50 volts. Nobody tests those battery-powered electric prods, but they produce a lot of voltage, actually. Not a lot of amperage. It's the amperage that'll kill you. Voltage hurts. So this piece right here, this output, actually comes from a time when slaughter facilities were direct wiring electric prods. So some of you guys have probably heard of this before, others haven't. I've seen relics of it in some of the older plants that I've gone into. So the way this would work is that in most facilities they'd have like a heavy cable, a bare cable, that they would have strung up over top of the animal handling facility. They'd have it insulated, and then they'd hook it into whatever available voltage they had, whatever available electricity they had in that area. And so that could be 115 volts, although more often than not, since it's a commercial facility, you're looking at 240 or 480. As a matter of fact, I was talking with a good friend of mine who started working in a plant that's now gone in the early 1980s. And at that time, it was also okay for them to smoke on the slaughter floor and when they were moving livestock around. It was a different time. And he said, you know, I never thought about it at the time when I was like 20 years old, but you know, I look back on this now and it kind of makes me think maybe I was a little dumb. He said, I used to light my cigarettes by taking the electric prod that I had for moving cattle. And can you guys arc weld? I loved arc weld. One of my favorite things to do. So you know when you're going to start arc welding, you tap and pull back, right? Okay. So he took, you can picture this now. So he'd take his electric prod wand and he would tap and pull back and he'd get this little blue arc going, toss his cigarette in his mouth, light his cigarette. Didn't think anything of it. That's a lot of power. That is a lot of electrical power. That's the reason why that portion of this regulation was written that way. It was to keep people from using that kind of power to try to get animals to move. That's inhumane. It is. It's just inhumane. So as far as non-compliance goes here, all right, the big things that they're going to look for are if livestock are excessively electric prodded. Remember, that is a little bit of a vague term, so you'll see some variation in that. If livestock are injured due to handling practices, and if they're deliberately moved faster than a normal walking speed. If you are chasing after them, making them run, you're going to get a non-compliance record for it. So along the way here, guys, if you have any questions, just ask. To a certain extent, I feel like I'm talking to my 9 o'clock a.m. lecture. Except you guys are all awake, which is a bonus. So if we continue along here with the handling of livestock, the next thing we need to focus on are downed animals or disabled animals. So there's been a lot of work on improving this section of 9 CFR 313, especially after the Westland Hallmark case a few years ago. And so within this, it says that if we're going to slaughter animals that are non-ambulatory, they have to be moved to a suspect pen if they're going to be allowed to recover. In the case of bovine animals, this is typically not the approach that is taken, with the exception of small veal calves that can be easily moved. In the case of fully grown cattle, the general approach is that if the animal cannot walk to slaughter, an animal should be euthanized and disposed of. Now, in order to move an animal, if we're going to move an animal to the suspect pen, we should use a sled, a sling, or a bucket of some sort. So you will see regulatory action take place if the animal is just dragged across the floor. If you grab a leg and just start walking with a conscious animal, you're going to get ridden on. Stunned or euthanized animals can be dragged. So another thing you can do in a small facility is that you can talk to your inspector if you have an animal that you're concerned may not enter your restraint box. Say you've got some sort of obstacle in the way that's going to make it difficult to get them into your restraint box. I worked in a facility once where we had a ramp, and the rise in that ramp was something like, it was like 8 feet over about 16 feet of length. And so it was steep, really steep. And so from time to time, I would actually ask our inspector if they would allow me to knock that animal at the bottom of the ramp and then winch them in to the slaughter floor. And so sometimes you can make that work, but you have to talk to your inspector about that and make sure that they're in line with what you're trying to do. So stunned or euthanized animals can be dragged. There's nothing wrong with that, because remember, welfare stopped as soon as that animal lost consciousness. Now, non-compliance is going to be documented, 1, if conscious animals are dragged, and 2, if disabled animals are not separated from normal non-ambulatory animals. So if you have an animal that goes down, like during a loading, you have to do something to try to protect that animal or move that animal before you continue to unload animals. Because if you run one over the top of that one that's down, you're going to be in trouble. Are there any questions so far? All right, don't be afraid to ask. Next we get to water. This is probably the clearest portion of the regulations in 9 CFR 313. The requirement is that animals shall have access to water in all holding pens, and if held longer than 24 hours, access to feed. As far as the access to feed goes, it just needs to be something that's appropriate for the animal. All right, so that doesn't mean that as you're walking out for the night, you throw a slice of pizza in with a steer that's hanging out there. All right, because that's not an appropriate feed source necessarily for that animal. But something like dry hay is perfectly fine. That'll work okay. The water requirement though, that's clear. That is crystal clear. In our state inspected facilities in Wisconsin, it's a regular thing actually for plants to receive NRs for water provision because it's difficult to do in small plants in some cases. This is one of those things you got to pay attention to. So that means check in on it. In the case of pigs, you may want to try to set up a nipple water. In the case of cattle, a nipple water is not going to count as a water source because the animal can't use it. So you have to make sure that you have an appropriate water source and that it's there for the animal at all times. So non-compliance in this case is going to be documented if livestock don't have access to water in the holding pens and in cases where the animals are overheated because of lack of proper shade or lack of water for cooling. And so this is another thing to keep in mind too. That water helps the animal to thermoregulate. Next we get to approved stunning methods. There are 3 classes of approved stunning methods that are included in this regulation. The classes are chemical, electrical, and mechanical stunning. As far as chemical stunning, the only type of chemical stunning that is expressly approved in 9 CFR 313 is carbon dioxide gas. It's typically used for swine. We also use it for poultry, but poultry aren't included in the Humane Slaughter Act. It's only red meat animals. As far as electrical stunning goes, that's pretty obvious. You're going to use electricity. We commonly see that on pigs and sheep in particular. In some cases, we'll also see electric stunning done on veal calves. In other countries, electrical stunning is used on larger animals. As a matter of fact, in New Zealand, it's actually common for slaughter facilities to use electric stunning for fully grown cattle. The issue we run into here, the reason why we don't do that nearly as much here in the States, is because it actually causes some pretty extensive carcass damage. So you can imagine just how much damage and how much that would cost if an animal breaks a femur due to the electric stun, because that's going to completely ruin the round. And that's not uncommon. We see that I think in the research I read from New Zealand, it was something like 6% of carcasses would have broken femurs that would have to be trimmed out. So if those systems aren't set up right, they don't work too well for large animals. And then we have our mechanical means of improved stunning methods. So those include gunshot and captive bolt. And so oftentimes we'll see those methods used on cattle and sheep, although we'll also see some people use captive bolt guns and firearms for swine. We can see a higher incidence of blood splash and petechial hemorrhages in swine that have been stunned with either a captive bolt gun or a firearm. In addition, those animals are a lot tougher to shackle. A lot of you guys know this already. This is nothing new for you. But a pig that's been captive bolt stunned really thrashes, even though they're unconscious. And it makes it a little bit tougher to get a shackle on. And if you let go of the